My name is Lena. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where competence is praised quietly and mistakes are amplified loudly. I've been described as dependable, low maintenance, someone who doesn't make things difficult. People often mistake that for softness. Or worse, permission. If you met me briefly, you might think I'm unremarkable. I don't dominate conversations. I don't have confidence. I listen more than I speak, and I tend to finish my work before anyone notices I've started it. That's usually where the underestimation begins. When you're calm, people assume you're unaffected. When you're quiet, they assume you're unaware. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, explosive way. It's about something slower, something more uncomfortable. It's about what happens when a small, human mistake becomes public property, when my mistake was screenshotted and shared in the company chat, and no one pauses to ask what that does to a person who already keeps herself small. It's also about what followed, not the error itself, but the silence after. The way messages were opened and left unanswered. The way accountability became spectacle. The read receipts hurt more than the error. Not because I was ashamed of being wrong, but because I was suddenly visible in the wrong way, and invisible in every way that mattered. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through what it feels like to be slowly repositioned in a system without being formally demoted. How disrespect can arrive disguised as just a joke, or just efficiency. How can you rationalize staying quiet because you don't want to be emotional, or difficult, or labeled? You'll hear how I normalized things that shouldn't have been normal. How I accepted a role that was never explicitly assigned but very clearly enforced. And then, without confrontation, without ultimatums, how something shifted inside me. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone noticed at first. This is a story about patience, documentation, and restraint. About learning the difference between being silent because you're afraid and being silent because you're choosing to observe. About discovering leverage not as a weapon, but as clarity. There are no heroes or villains here. No shouting matches, no last-minute rescues. Just people behaving exactly as they always had, and one person deciding she would no longer absorb the cost of that behavior quietly. I'm telling this now because many of us have lived some version of it. A moment when you realize the environment you're loyal to is not loyal to you. When you understand that staying calm doesn't always keep you safe. It just makes you easier to overlook. So before I continue, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed quiet after being hurt? Not because you didn't notice, but because you were waiting to understand what it meant? To them, I was reliable, not impressive, not memorable. Just reliable in the way that makes people stop checking behind you. The kind of person whose name doesn't come up in meetings unless something needs to be fixed quickly and quietly. I was the one CC'd late, looped in at the last minute, trusted to handle it without needing clarification or praise. I didn't mind that, at first. There's a certain safety in being the person no one questions. When expectations are low and consistent, you learn how to exceed them silently. I took pride in being steady, in being the calm presence when others were reactive. I believed competence spoke for itself, but competence without visibility doesn't speak. It just absorbs. In the office, I sat near the window, slightly removed from the center cluster of desks. People passed me on their way to louder conversations. When something went wrong, my inbox filled. When things went right, silence. That pattern felt normal, almost comforting. I told myself I didn't need recognition, that I valued peace more than praise. What I didn't admit, at least not yet, was how quickly reliable turned into expendable. How easily being agreeable slid into being overlooked. When you don't assert, others assign. I became the unofficial buffer, the one who softened rough edges. If a deadline was missed upstream, I adjusted. If instructions were unclear, I interpreted. If a client was confused, I explained. My job quietly expanded into emotional and operational cleanup. And because I did it well, it became invisible. People often confuse silence with consent. But silence can also be calculation, exhaustion, or hope. At that stage, mine was hope. Hope that consistency would eventually be seen, that trust would be reciprocal, that if I stayed patient, fairness would surface on its own. I remember how people spoke around me. Not unkindly, just casually dismissive. Jokes I was expected to absorb. Decisions were made without me, then handed to me for execution. My name is rarely attached to outcomes, but always attached to responsibility. No one explicitly disrespected me. That's the part that makes it difficult to explain. It was all soft edges, plausible deniability, nothing you could quote without sounding sensitive. So I internalized it. I told myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there, but patterns don't require intention to be real. In group chats, my messages were acknowledged with reactions instead of responses. Thumbs up, check marks, read receipts without follow-up. I noticed who got quick clarifications and who got silence. I noticed how my calm demeanor was used as justification for giving me more, not better. I didn't complain. I didn't escalate. I didn't document, yet, not with intention. I was still operating under the belief that fairness was organic, that professionalism was enough. Looking back, I see how clearly I was defined, just not out loud. I was the steady background presence, the one who wouldn't make things awkward, the one who wouldn't push back unless absolutely necessary, the one safe to overlook. And there's a strange loneliness in that role. Because when you're useful but unseen, you start questioning whether your value exists only in what you can absorb for others. At that point in the story, I still believed silence was neutrality. I hadn't yet learned that silence is read as agreement by those who benefit from it. I was exactly who they expected me to be. And for a while, I thought that was enough. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. A minor error. A timestamp is out of sync. One line in a shared document didn't update the way it should have. The kind of thing that gets corrected quietly, logged, and forgotten. I noticed it myself within minutes and fixed it before it affected anything external. Normally, that would have been the end of it. But that morning, before I even had time to follow up, my phone vibrated. Then again, and again. The company group chat, usually reserved for updates and logistics, had become active in a way it rarely did so early. Someone had taken a screenshot. My screen. My cursor. My name is clearly visible in the corner. The error is circled in red. No context, no explanation, just dropped into the chat like evidence. No caption at first, just the image. Then a message underneath it. Casual. Almost playful. Something like, "Can someone double-check this?" No name mentioned. No acknowledgement that it had already been resolved. Just the implication, floating there for everyone to interpret. I stared at my phone longer than I should have. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was trying to decide whether this was something I was supposed to respond to at all. If I spoke up, would I look defensive? If I stayed quiet, would it look like guilt? Before I could decide, the read receipts began appearing, one by one. People are opening the message, seeing the screenshot, moving on. No one asked if it had been fixed. No one said mistakes happen. No one messaged me privately. The silence wasn't neutral. It was directional. It flowed away from me. I typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. Eventually, I sent something brief. Professional. I acknowledged the issue, explained it had already been corrected, and thanked them for flagging it. I added a timestamp. I added clarity. I did everything right. It landed softly. Too softly. No follow-up. No acknowledgement. Just a few more read receipts. Then the conversation shifted to something else, as if nothing had happened. But something had, not because of the mistake, but because of how it was handled. Errors weren't new. Screenshots weren't new. But this was the first time mine had been broadcast without discretion, without context, without care. I told myself it was efficient. That may be the person who shared it didn't think it through. That intent mattered more than impact. I didn't want to assign meaning where there might be none. Still, I noticed how my chest tightened when I opened the chat after that. How I double-checked everything before sharing it publicly. How I became more careful. Not because I was careless before, but because I had been exposed. That's the quiet cost of public correction. It doesn't teach you accuracy. It teaches you fear. What stayed with me most wasn't the screenshot itself. It was the absence of response after. The way visibility arrived was only when there was something to point at. The way my explanation disappeared into the scroll, unread in spirit if not in fact. Later that day, someone referenced the issue in passing. Not to me, to someone else. As an example. I wasn't named, but I was present. I smiled. I nodded. I stayed composed. Inside, something registered. This wasn't an attack. It wasn't cruelty. It was something subtler. A shift in how care was distributed. A signal about whose mistakes were private and whose were communal. And because no one reacted strongly, I told myself not to either. I made a mental note. Not emotional, just factual. This was the first small cut, and no one else seemed to feel it but me. After the screenshot, nothing changed on the surface. That's what made it easier to ignore, and harder to forget. No apology followed. No clarification. The rhythm of work resumed exactly as before. Tasks arrived. Deadlines stacked. Conversations moved on. If anything, the moment dissolved too quickly, as if acknowledging it would have required more care than anyone was willing to give. So I adjusted. At first, the adjustments were subtle. I reread messages before sending them. I added extra context where it wasn't strictly necessary. I anticipated questions before they were asked. Not because I doubted my work, but because I had learned how easily something small could be extracted and displayed without protection. I told myself this was growth, professional maturity, thick skin. That's how normalization begins. Soon, similar moments followed. Not identical, but familiar enough to rhyme. A comment made in a meeting framed my role as support rather than strategy. A decision was finalized without my input, then sent to me to implement. A joke about me being the organized one, delivered with a smile that made it difficult to challenge without seeming humorless. Each instance, taken alone, was minor, forgettable, defensible. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns don't need volume to be loud. What made it worse was how often I defended the behavior, mostly to myself. I told myself everyone was busy, that I wasn't being singled out. Maybe I was just more sensitive because of the earlier incident. I didn't want to be the person who reads intent into efficiency, so I stayed quiet. Silence became a coping mechanism. When messages went unanswered, I assumed people were occupied. When my contributions weren't credited, I reminded myself that the work still mattered. When I felt the urge to speak up, I asked whether it would actually change anything, or just mark me as difficult. There's a particular kind of professionalism that rewards restraint while quietly punishing presence. I was very good at that version of professionalism. I watched others push back. I watched them question decisions openly, interrupt meetings, and assert ownership. Some were praised for being direct. Others were tolerated because they were loud enough to require it. I wasn't either. I was efficient, polite, replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice. That contradiction is exhausting. Over time, I noticed how my own internal language shifted. I stopped thinking, they should have asked me, and started thinking, I should have said something sooner. I took responsibility for dynamics I didn't create. I framed my silence as a choice, even when it felt more like survival. The disrespect didn't escalate. It settled in. It became ambient. The background noise of work. And that's the danger. When something becomes normal, you stop measuring it. You stop reacting. You stop checking whether it aligns with your values or just your tolerance. I began to anticipate being overlooked. I preemptively filled gaps. I smoothed transitions. I carried information across teams without credit. And because I did it well, it reinforced the belief that this was my role. No one told me to stay in my lane. They just built the road around me. There were moments I almost spoke up, drafted messages I never sent, paused mid-sentence in meetings and let someone else finish the thought. Each time I chose composure. Each time I told myself I was being strategic. But strategy without direction is just endurance. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly tired. Tired of being careful. Tired of being responsible without authority. Tired of watching respect get distributed based on volume instead of value. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was temporary, that this was just how teams function sometimes, that if I kept my head down, things would even out. What I didn't realize then was that by accepting the pattern, I was teaching them how to treat me. And once a behavior is normalized, it stops feeling like a choice to the people benefiting from it. It just feels like the way things are. It wasn't announced. There was no meeting where someone said, "This is who you are now." No document outlining expectations. No formal shift in title or compensation. But the role was clear. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed friction so others could move faster. The person who filled in gaps without needing to be asked. The quiet constant that allowed everyone else to operate with more range, more error, more confidence. At first, I thought that role came from trust, that being relied on meant being respected. But there's a difference between being trusted and being taken for granted. And I was slowly crossing that line without noticing when it happened. My responsibilities expanded sideways, not upward. I became the point of contact for issues that didn't belong to any one department. I was looped into conversations late, expected to catch up instantly, and then deliver results as if I'd been there from the start. When things went smoothly, the credit floated elsewhere. When something stalled, my name resurfaced. I didn't protest, I adapted. People framed it as a compliment. "You're so dependable. You always know what's going on. We couldn't do this without you." Statements that sounded affirming until you realized they came without boundaries, without support, without reciprocity. In meetings, I noticed how decisions were made. Ideas moved forward when voiced with confidence, not necessarily accuracy. When I offered input, it was often treated as supplemental, useful, but not central. I was the footnote, not the headline. And because I didn't demand space, I wasn't given any. The role required emotional restraint. I was expected to remain calm, no matter the pressure, to smooth over miscommunication, to translate urgency into action without showing strain. I became the person people came to when things were already messy, because they knew I wouldn't make it messier. There's a quiet cost to being the reliable one. You don't get the benefit of the doubt when you falter. You don't get the protection of visibility. You're assumed to be fine because you always have been. I started noticing how my time was treated. Meetings are scheduled during my focus hours. Last-minute requests framed as emergencies. Delays elsewhere are becoming my problem to solve. And when I pushed back gently, the surprise was immediate, as if resistance hadn't been part of my character before. That's when I understood. The role I was assigned depended on my compliance, not obedience, just predictability. They needed to know I wouldn't disrupt the flow, that I wouldn't escalate, that I would quietly carry what others dropped. And I did, for a while. I told myself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, there would be space to recalibrate, that my consistency would eventually translate into authority. But authority doesn't emerge from silence. It's either claimed or granted, and I was doing neither. The role also came with emotional expectations. I was expected to be understanding, flexible, patient. When stress ran high, I was the calm in the room. When tensions flared, I was the buffer. My emotional labor wasn't acknowledged because it was never dramatic. That's the paradox. When you manage things well, no one sees the management. I wasn't angry yet, but I was aware. Aware that I was being shaped by the environment more than shaping it. aware that the role benefited everyone except me. Aware that staying quiet was no longer neutral, it was reinforcing the structure. I began to see myself through their eyes. Not as a peer, but as a function. A reliable system component. Necessary, but interchangeable. And something about that realization settled heavily. Because once you understand the role you've been assigned, you're faced with a choice. Continue playing it, or quietly prepare to step out of it. At the end of that phase, I was still performing, still meeting expectations, still doing what was asked. But internally, something had shifted. I was no longer unaware. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where someone crossed a line so clearly that it demanded a response. If anything, the day itself was unremarkable. A midweek morning, overcast. The kind of day that blends into the others without leaving a mark. That's why it stayed with me. I was reviewing a thread from the previous afternoon. Messages I'd already read, already acted on. A request had come in late, framed as urgent, and I had adjusted my schedule to accommodate it. I delivered what was asked before the end of the day. Clean, complete, on time. That morning, I noticed a reply that hadn't been there before. It wasn't critical. It wasn't even rude. It was a short message acknowledging the work, then immediately redirecting the credit elsewhere. A small reframing, subtle enough that no one would question it. Familiar enough that I recognized the pattern instantly. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, and something inside me settled. Not anger, not hurt, just clarity. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain, or correct, or justify my contribution. I didn't feel the familiar tension of deciding whether to speak up or let it go. I simply observed the moment as it was. This is how it works, I thought. This is the structure. There was a strange calm in that realization. When you stop hoping for fairness, you stop being surprised by its absence. When you stop expecting people to act differently, you can finally see them clearly. I closed the thread and opened my notebook. The slim black one I'd been carrying for months, mostly unused. I hadn't intended it to become anything significant. It was just a place to jot things down. Reminders, observations, loose ends. That morning, I wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then I wrote one sentence, factual, no emotion, just what had happened. That was it. No commentary, no analysis, just a record. I didn't know why I did it. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't angry enough to seek leverage. I just felt an internal click, like a door closing softly behind me. From that moment on, silence felt different. Before, it had been reactive, a way to avoid conflict, a method of self-protection. Now it felt intentional, observational, almost curious. I went through the rest of the day as usual, responded to messages, attended meetings, delivered work. Nothing outwardly changed. No one noticed anything different. But internally, I had stopped volunteering emotional labor. I stopped assuming good intent where patterns existed. I stopped absorbing responsibility for dynamics I didn't control. I stopped interpreting behavior through hope and started interpreting it through evidence. It was subtle, but it mattered. I noticed how often credit was redistributed, how decisions were framed after the fact, how urgency was selectively applied. I noticed who benefited from ambiguity and who bore the cost of it. And I wrote things down, not obsessively, not dramatically, just enough to preserve clarity. Dates, context, outcomes, nothing subjective, nothing that couldn't stand on its own. There was relief in that. Relief in naming reality without reacting to it. Relief in no longer carrying everything internally. That day wasn't the beginning of action. It was the beginning of orientation. I wasn't preparing to confront anyone. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't strategizing an outcome. I was simply choosing to see. And that choice changed everything. Because once you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you gain a different kind of freedom. A quieter one. One that doesn't announce itself. By the end of that week, I had filled several pages. Not with grievances, but with patterns. And for the first time since the screenshot, I didn't feel exposed. I felt grounded. The shift wasn't dramatic. No one would have noticed it from the outside. But internally, the role I was playing had already begun to loosen. I was no longer waiting for permission to be seen. I was preparing to decide what visibility would mean on my own terms. Once I stopped reacting, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been a reflex. A way to keep things smooth. A strategy for staying safe. Now, it has become deliberate. I wasn't withholding information. I wasn't disengaging. I was simply no longer filling every gap by default. That difference mattered. I still responded to messages. I still met deadlines. I still showed up prepared. But I stopped anticipating needs that weren't clearly articulated. I stopped translating vague requests into polished outcomes. I stopped correcting assumptions that benefited someone else more than me. At first, no one noticed. Silence is easy to misread when people are accustomed to you doing the emotional and cognitive labor for them. They assume things are still happening behind the scenes, that you're still absorbing the friction, that the system will self-correct the way it always has. I let them believe that. Meetings became interesting. I spoke less, but when I did, it was precise. I asked clarifying questions instead of offering solutions. I let pauses stretch. I watched who rushed to fill them and who grew uncomfortable. There's a kind of power in not rescuing a conversation. Some people mistook the shift for withdrawal. Others assumed I was busy. A few interpreted it as compliance, thinking I had finally settled into the role fully, no longer needing reassurance or recognition. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because while they were adjusting their expectations downward, I was refining mine upward. I paid attention to how decisions were documented. Who followed up? Who didn't? I noticed which processes relied disproportionately on my memory, my continuity, my quiet follow-through, and I began to let that reliance surface. Not by failing, but by asking, by requiring clarity, by returning responsibility to where it originated. When something was unclear, I asked for specifics instead of filling in the blanks. When something was late, I noted the timeline instead of absorbing the delay. Each small boundary felt almost invisible, but together, they shifted the weight. Some people responded with confusion, a few with mild irritation. Nothing overt, just a subtle discomfort at having to articulate things they'd grown used to outsourcing emotionally and cognitively. I stayed calm. I didn't explain the change. I didn't announce new boundaries. I didn't justify myself. That would have invited negotiation. Instead, I let my behavior speak, and something else happened. Something I hadn't anticipated. People started to reveal themselves. Without my constant smoothing, patterns became visible. Miscommunications that had been quietly resolved now lingered. Assumptions went uncorrected. Decisions lacked follow-through. Not because I had changed the system, but because I had stopped compensating for its gaps. I documented everything, not in a punitive way, in a neutral, almost administrative way. Dates, requests, responses, outcomes. I wrote as if someone else might read it one day. Not because I planned to show it to anyone, but because it kept me honest. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space reveals structure. I also noticed how much energy I had reclaimed. The mental bandwidth is freed up by not anticipating everyone else's needs. The emotional relief of not managing reactions preemptively. For the first time in months, I wasn't tired at the end of the day. I wasn't angry either. That was the most surprising part. Choosing silence didn't make me feel smaller. It made me feel centered. I wasn't disappearing. I was consolidating. Some people grew more careful around me. Others grew bolder, assuming my quiet meant consent. I let both happen, because I was no longer trying to correct their perception of me. I was watching how they behaved when they thought I wasn't paying attention. And in that observation, I began to understand where my real leverage lived. Not in confrontation, not in volume, but in continuity, in knowing how things actually worked. It is the thread that connects decisions to outcomes. in holding the quiet institutional memory that no one else bothered to record. They thought my silence meant I had accepted my place. In reality, I had chosen it. And choice changes everything. What they never noticed was how much of the system lived in my head. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, but because I had been there consistently. While others rotated roles, shifted priorities, or moved on to more visible projects, I stayed. I carried context. I remembered why decisions were made, not just what they were. I knew which processes existed on paper and which ones only worked because someone quietly adjusted them along the way. That someone had been me. For years, I had connected dots without naming it as a skill. I knew which approvals were symbolic and which ones mattered, which stakeholders needed reassurance, and which needed evidence. I knew where timelines stretched and where they snapped. I knew which shortcuts created future problems and which ones were harmless. And because I never framed that knowledge as power, no one else did either. As my silence became more intentional, I began to externalize what had always been internal. I didn't announce it. I didn't flag it as preparation. I simply started documenting processes as they actually operated, not as they were supposed to. I created timelines, dependency maps, decision trees. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. When someone asked how something worked, I answered accurately, but without cushioning. If a process depended on undocumented steps or informal handoffs, I named that. If something relied on my memory, I wrote it down. I noticed how often people said, "Lena knows," without realizing what that implied. So I made sure Lena knew wasn't the same as Lena compensating. I also paid attention to tone. Not what people said, but how they said it. Who assumed urgency? Who assumed compliance? Who framed requests as favors? And who framed them as expectations? I logged those differences, not emotionally, but structurally. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped filtering them through optimism. I saw how accountability flowed downward, but rarely upward. How errors were individualized while successes were collectivized. How visibility protected some people and exposed others. And I realized something important. My invisibility had allowed me to see things others couldn't. When you're not perceived as a threat, people are careless around you. They speak freely. They forward messages without context. They assume you won't connect dots that benefit you. They were wrong. I began keeping versions of conversations, screenshots, timestamps. Not in a way that disrupted my work, but in a way that preserved accuracy. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting truth. There's a difference. I also started asking myself harder questions. Not about them, but about me. Why had I tolerated so much ambiguity? Why had I equated being easy to work with being valuable? Why had I believed that patience would eventually be rewarded? Those answers weren't comfortable, but they were clarifying. As weeks passed, the gap between perception and reality widened. On the surface, nothing had changed. I was still the dependable one. Still calm, still quiet, still performing. Underneath, I was repositioning. I noticed which responsibilities were uniquely mine and which could be redistributed. I stopped being the default for things that weren't formally assigned. I asked for documentation where none existed. I clarified ownership in writing. Some people resisted. Not openly, but passively. Delayed responses. Vague acknowledgments. The usual signs of discomfort when systems are asked to become explicit. I stayed steady. What they never noticed was that by making things visible, I was reducing my own risk. I was no longer the single point of failure or success. I was building a record that reflected reality, not reputation. And that record began to matter. Because once information exists outside your head, it changes how power moves. It creates accountability. It limits plausible deniability. I wasn't planning to use it against anyone, but I was no longer willing to carry it alone. The most important thing they never noticed, though, wasn't the documentation. It was the shift in how I saw myself. I stopped seeing my calm as passivity. I stopped seeing my restraint as weakness. I stopped measuring my worth by how little disruption I caused. Instead, I began to see myself as a constant in a system that relied heavily on constants, but rarely acknowledged them. And constants, when they move, change everything. I didn't rush. I didn't reveal anything prematurely. I didn't force outcomes. I just kept watching, recording, clarifying, letting the system show me exactly how it functioned without my interference. And in that observation, I found something more valuable than validation. I found leverage. The reveal didn't come from a single discovery. It was cumulative, quiet, almost anticlimactic. One afternoon, while reviewing a process map I'd been refining, I noticed something that had always been there, but had never been named. A dependency that ran through me. Not formally, not in any org chart or responsibility matrix, but functionally, undeniably. Several workflows, critical ones, only worked because I bridged gaps no one else had ownership over. If I stepped back, nothing would collapse immediately. That was the illusion. The system would continue, just long enough for people to assume everything was fine. Then delays would compound. Miscommunications would surface. Accountability would scatter. And no one would know exactly where the problem started. Except me. That realization wasn't empowering in the way movies make it look. There was no rush, no satisfaction, just a steady, grounding sense of clarity. This is how it works. I cross-referenced timelines, compared past incidents, looked at where I had intervened quietly and where I hadn't. The pattern held. My value wasn't in what I produced, it was in what I prevented. I sat with that for a long time, because leverage like that comes with responsibility. Not moral superiority, but choice. The choice to continue absorbing the cost, or to stop. And stopping didn't have to mean sabotage. It didn't have to mean confrontation. It could simply mean letting the system experience itself without my invisible corrections. That was the moment I understood the difference between power and control. Control demands action. Power allows restraint. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. Not a friend, not a colleague, not even in my own notes. I didn't need to externalize it. Naming it privately was enough. From that point on, every decision became cleaner. When I was asked to just handle something vague, I asked for clarity. When I was looped in late, I documented the timing. When credit shifted, I noted the language used. I wasn't collecting proof for a confrontation. I was building an internal compass. And with that compass, I saw something else. The people who benefited most from my invisibility were not malicious. They were comfortable. They had built workflows that assumed someone else would absorb friction. When that someone didn't object, the system rewarded the assumption. I wasn't angry at them, but I was done protecting them from awareness. The reveal also clarified my options. I could speak up loudly, force recognition, demand a redefinition of my role. That would require emotional labor and risk backlash. I could leave quietly, find another environment, start over. Clean, but costly. Or I could stay, temporarily, and stop compensating. Not withdrawing, not failing. Just performing exactly what was asked. No more, and no less. Letting gaps surface naturally. Letting accountability land where it belonged. That option felt irreversible, because once you stop compensating, you can't unsee the imbalance. You can't return to innocence. You can't pretend the system is fair when you know exactly how it operates. I chose to keep observing a little longer. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the truth I was uncovering. I wanted to be certain, not emotionally, structurally. And certainty arrived quietly. A missed handoff, a delayed response, a meeting that ended without decisions because the connective tissue wasn't there. I watched it happen without intervening. No panic, no guilt, just confirmation. The system didn't break, but it wobbled. And in that wobble, I saw exactly how much I had been holding. The private reveal wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about winning. It was about consent. I realized I had been consenting to a role that cost me dignity under the guise of professionalism. And consent, once withdrawn, changes the entire dynamic, even if no one else knows it yet. I closed my notebook that day and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, alignment. I knew what I had. I knew what it meant. And I knew I didn't need to announce it for it to be real. The quietest power is knowing you could change everything, and choosing when or if to do so. Knowing something and acting on it are very different experiences. Once the private reveal settled, I entered a strange, suspended space. Nothing urgent demanded a move. No crisis forced my hand. And yet, every day carried a low, steady pressure, the kind that comes from awareness without resolution. I had options, real ones, and each came with consequences I couldn't ignore. The first option was confrontation. Not explosive, measured. I could request a formal meeting, present my observations, ask for role clarity, recognition, and boundaries. It would be clean, transparent, and risky, because confrontation doesn't just surface issues, it exposes power dynamics. And I had seen enough to know that clarity wouldn't be welcomed by everyone. Some would respond defensively. Others would reframe. A few might subtly reposition me as the problem. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was wary of misdirection. The second option was departure. Quiet, professional, unceremonious. I could find another role where my skills were better aligned with visibility and respect. I could start fresh, free from accumulated context and quiet compromises. That option was tempting, but it felt incomplete. Leaving without understanding the full weight of my contribution would mean carrying the same pattern forward, just in a different environment. I didn't want escape. I wanted agency. The third option was the most subtle and the most irreversible. I could stop absorbing, not as a protest, not as punishment, but as alignment. I could perform my role as defined, not as assumed. I could let systems experience the absence of my invisible labor. I could allow accountability to land where it belonged, without commentary or emotion. That option required patience, discipline, restraint, and once chosen, it couldn't be undone. Because the moment you stop compensating, the system reveals itself. And once revealed, there's no returning to the illusion that things were fine. I weighed these options carefully, not emotionally, but structurally. I mapped outcomes, considered timelines, observed reactions. I asked myself not what felt satisfying, but what preserved my integrity. And the answer was clear. I chose the irreversible option. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. From that point on, every action became deliberate. I responded to what was asked. I clarified the scope in writing. I documented dependencies. I declined to rescue vague requests. I stopped translating urgency into priority, unless it was formally defined. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't justify it. I simply embodied it. At first, the system resisted. Gently, with confusion, with the assumption that I would eventually step back in. I didn't. And something interesting happened. People began to feel the weight they had been deflecting. Not all at once. Not catastrophically, but enough to notice. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Decisions stalled. The friction I had absorbed for so long re-entered circulation. I stayed calm. I didn't point it out. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't explain what was happening, because an explanation would have softened the impact. This wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about restoring balance. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by respect. For myself and for the truth. I accepted that some relationships might change, that some perceptions might shift, that some doors might close. That was part of the cost. But I also knew that continuing as I had been was no longer an option, not without betraying my own clarity. So I moved forward, not loudly, not visibly, but with intention. The system was already adjusting, and I was no longer inside it the way I had been before. I had stepped just far enough back to let it reveal itself. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the point. I still logged in at the same time, still attended the same meetings, still delivered what was explicitly assigned to me. If someone had asked, they would have said I was steady, professional, unchanged. But internally, everything I did passed through a new filter. Is this my responsibility? Or am I being asked to absorb uncertainty for someone else? If it were the former, I handled it cleanly. If it was the latter, I slowed down. Not out of resistance, but out of precision. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment. About making sure your actions match your role, not the expectations others quietly place on you. I stopped jumping in when conversations drifted. I let meetings end without resolution if no one had taken ownership. I followed up only on what had been formally assigned, not what I sensed needed doing. When someone asked me to just take a look, I asked what decision they needed to make and by when. When someone forwarded a problem without context, I asked where it originated. When timelines were unclear, I documented the ambiguity instead of resolving it privately. None of this was confrontational. It was procedural, and procedure has a way of feeling cold to people who are used to warmth doing the work for them. I also became very careful with language. I stopped using phrases that implied availability without boundaries. No more happy to help or I can just take care of that. I replaced them with neutral confirmations. Clear scopes. Written summaries. I wasn't withdrawing. I was defining. Behind the scenes, I continued documenting. Not obsessively, methodically. I tracked handoffs, recorded delays, noted where decisions stalled and why. I didn't interpret motives. I didn't assign blame. I just captured reality as it unfolded. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was at first. People are slow to notice when support disappears gradually. They assume it's temporary, that someone will step in, the system will self-correct. But systems only self-correct when someone pays the cost. I wasn't paying it anymore. A few weeks in, I noticed subtle changes. Longer email threads, more follow-up questions, slight tension in meetings where things used to flow smoothly. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to be felt. Still, no one connected it to me, because I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't changed my tone. I hadn't reduced my output. I had simply stopped filling gaps that were never mine to begin with. That's the power of moving in silence. You don't trigger defenses. You don't invite debate. You let behavior speak. I also began quietly preparing for contingencies. Updating my records. Reviewing policies. Understanding where formal responsibility ended and informal expectation began. I didn't involve anyone else. I didn't signal intent. I just made sure I was protected. There was a strange peace in that phase. A sense of control that didn't rely on anyone else's recognition. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was making myself legible. To myself. And with that legibility came confidence. Not the loud kind. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. I knew that if someone questioned my performance, I could answer clearly. If someone asked why something hadn't moved, I could point to documented timelines. If someone tried to reassign responsibility retroactively, I had records. I wasn't preparing to attack. I was preparing to stand still. Because when you stop moving to accommodate others, the imbalance becomes visible on its own. And once it's visible, it can't be unseen. Still, no one said anything. They were just beginning to feel it. The first signs didn't come as a confrontation. They came in confusion. The meeting ran long and ended without a clear decision. An email thread circled the same question 3 times without resolution. A task stalled because no one was quite sure who owned the next step. Small things, easily dismissed. But I noticed how often my name appeared in follow-up messages. Not as a request, but as a question. Has Lena seen this? Do we know if Lena handled that? Can Lena confirm? I responded when it was appropriate. I clarified what had been assigned to me and what hadn't. Calmly, factually. And for the first time, the answers weren't satisfying. Because people weren't used to hearing, "That wasn't in my scope." Or, "I wasn't looped in on that decision." Or, "I don't have context on this." They weren't used to the absence of my assumption. At first, they tried to reroute around it, asking others, revisiting old threads, hoping the answer existed somewhere else. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. The system had grown dependent on my continuity, in my memory, on my quiet corrections. Without them, things didn't fail, but they slowed. They became visible. They required effort, and effort has a way of drawing attention. I noticed a shift in tone. Messages became more careful. Questions are more specific. Deadlines are more explicit. Not because people had changed, but because they were adjusting to friction they hadn't felt before. Still, no one addressed it directly. It's uncomfortable to name a loss you didn't realize you were benefiting from. In one meeting, someone joked about things feeling less smooth lately. There was laughter, agreement, no conclusion. I said nothing, because this wasn't about calling it out. It was about letting it land. I also noticed something else. The people who had benefited most from my invisible labor were the ones who struggled the most. Not maliciously, just unpracticed at carrying the weight themselves. They weren't bad people. They were unaccustomed to accountability without a buffer. And I had been that buffer. As consequences accumulated, they didn't point to me. They pointed everywhere else. Process gaps, communication issues, external delays, everything except the missing constant. That's how invisible work operates. It's only noticed in its absence. I stayed consistent, calm, professional. I didn't gloat. I didn't withdraw further. I didn't step in to rescue. I let things take the time they took. And slowly attention shifted. Not to blame, but to inquire. People began asking how things used to work. What I had done differently. What steps were missing now? I answered honestly, without embellishment, without self-promotion. And in doing so, I made something clear without saying it outright. What you thought was the system was often just me. That realization unsettles people, because it forces a reevaluation, not just of roles, but of assumptions, of who carries what, of who absorbs the cost of smoothness. I didn't enjoy this phase. It wasn't satisfying to watch others struggle. It wasn't validating to see friction emerge. It was simply necessary, because until the consequences surface, nothing changes. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed alignment. And alignment only happens when reality is allowed to assert itself. By the end of that phase, the atmosphere had shifted. Subtly. Conversations carried more weight. Decisions took longer, but were more deliberate. Accountability began to be redistributed. Not evenly, not perfectly, but differently. And that difference marked the beginning of something no one had anticipated, including me. By the time they tried to address it, the shape of the problem had already changed. What began as confusion hardened into discomfort. Then into urgency. Not panic, not yet, but a collective sense that something wasn't aligning the way it used to. Timelines slipped more visibly. Dependencies surfaced too late. Questions that once had immediate answers now required meetings. That's when people started looking backward. Not to assign blame, but to recover what had been lost. I noticed the shift in language first. Messages that used to be assumed are now asked. Requests that were once casual became careful. There was a subtle return of politeness, of context, of acknowledgement. But it arrived late, because it wasn't paired with understanding. People wanted things to go back to normal, without examining what normal had cost. They wanted efficiency, without ownership. Smoothness without support. In one meeting, someone said, "We might need to tighten processes again. Things feel scattered." Heads nodded. Notes were taken. Action items assigned. I listened quietly, because tightening a system doesn't restore what made it work. It just exposes what was never formalized. They began implementing fixes. New templates. Additional checklists. More meetings. None of them addressed the core issue, that the system had relied on unacknowledged labor, and that labor was no longer freely given. A few people reached out to me directly, friendly, curious, framed as collaboration. "Can you help us understand how you used to manage this? Do you have insights on what might be missing? Is there anything we should be doing differently?" I answered honestly. I explained what I had done, without framing it as a sacrifice. I described the steps, the time, the decisions. I didn't say I had been carrying too much. I didn't say anyone had taken advantage. I let the facts speak, and I could see the realization land. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet recalibration, a dawning awareness that what they were trying to fix wasn't a process, it was a person. But here's the thing about awareness that arrives late. It doesn't restore trust. It creates regret, and regret is uncomfortable. It makes people want to reverse things quickly, to apologize, to reset, to smooth over what's been exposed. But some shifts can't be undone, because by the time they noticed the gap, I had already redefined my relationship to it. I wasn't willing to step back into the role as it had been, not without clarity, not without boundaries, not without recognition, not in the form of praise, but in structure. And structure takes time. They wanted immediate relief. I wanted long-term alignment. Those goals didn't match. I could feel the tension in conversations, the careful phrasing, the subtle attempts to re-engage me as the stabilizer, the unspoken hope that I would resume compensating now that it was being acknowledged. But acknowledgement without change is just nostalgia. I didn't say no. I just didn't say yes. I continued to operate within my defined scope. Continued to document. Continued to ask for clarity. Continued to let ownership sit where it belonged. And gradually, it became clear that the old dynamic wasn't coming back. Not because I refused, but because I had moved. The role they were trying to recover no longer existed in the same way. And recreating it would require a redistribution of responsibility that no one was fully prepared for. That's when discomfort turned into something else. Not anger, not blame. Acceptance. Too late to fix it. Not because it was broken beyond repair, but because the person who had held it together had changed. And once someone changes in response to clarity, you can't ask them to unknow what they know. The system would adapt, but it would never again be carried quietly. The conversation finally happened on a Thursday afternoon, not because I demanded it, but because the system could no longer pretend everything was fine. A calendar invite appeared with a neutral title. No urgency markers. No agenda beyond alignment. That alone told me everything. I joined the call on time. Camera on. Posture relaxed. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't need to. Everything I needed was already documented, and more importantly, already understood by me. They spoke first, carefully, respectfully. There was acknowledgement now, of my consistency, of my institutional knowledge, of the way things used to run smoothly. The language was appreciative but vague, praise without specificity, regret without accountability. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't reference emotions. I didn't even mention the screenshot, the chat, the read receipts. I stayed with facts. I explained how my role had evolved informally over time, how responsibilities had expanded without clarity. Decisions were often made without my input, but I relied on my follow-through. I referenced timelines, processes, dependencies. Not once did I say you. I said the system. That matters. Because once you remove the accusation, what remains is the truth. There was a pause after I finished. Not awkward, reflective. The kind of silence that means something has landed. They asked what I wanted. It was the first time that question had been asked without assumptions attached. I answered simply. I wanted a defined scope. Clear ownership. Documentation that reflected reality. Recognition not as praise, but as structure, so that responsibility and authority are aligned. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't ask for validation. I didn't ask to be seen differently. I asked for the system to change. And here's the thing about calm confrontation. It doesn't give people much to push against. There was no defensiveness, no debate, just nods, notes, agreement that things needed to be clarified. But I could also feel the loss. Because what they were agreeing to wasn't just a set of changes. It was the end of an era where things worked because someone absorbed the cost quietly. I made it clear that I would continue to do my job well, that I was invested in outcomes, that I wasn't disengaging, but I was no longer willing to operate in ambiguity. No ultimatums, no deadlines, no threats, just a boundary. When the meeting ended, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I felt steady. Because confrontation without heat isn't about winning. It's about standing where you are and letting that be enough. After that day, things did change. Slowly, imperfectly, Processes were clarified, ownership redistributed. Some things improved, others remained clumsy. But the dynamic between me and the system was different. I was no longer invisible, not because I demanded attention, but because I had stopped disappearing. And that kind of presence doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be consistent. I'm still quiet. That's the part people often expect to change, but it hasn't. I don't dominate meetings. I don't have authority. I don't narrate my value in real time. What has changed is my relationship to silence. Before, silence was something that happened to me, a byproduct of caution, of patience, of hoping things would resolve on their own. Now silence is something I use with intention. It's no longer a void, it's a boundary. I understand my role clearly now, not just on paper, but in practice. What I own, what I don't. Where my responsibility begins and ends. That clarity has given me a steadiness I didn't have before. I no longer rush to fill gaps. I let questions hang if they don't belong to me. I allow processes to be imperfect without taking it as a personal failure. I trust that if something matters, it will be defined. And if it isn't, I don't absorb it. That shift has changed how people interact with me. Some are more respectful. Others are more careful. A few are still adjusting. That's fine. I'm not managing their comfort anymore. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt once I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. Not just at work, but internally. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped drafting imaginary explanations, stopped wondering if I was being too much or not enough. I know where I stand now. And because I know, I don't need to prove it. I've also become more precise with empathy. I still care. I still collaborate. But I no longer confuse understanding with self-erasure. I can acknowledge someone else's pressure without taking responsibility for it. That distinction took time to learn. Looking back, I don't resent the version of myself who stayed quiet. She was doing what she thought was right with the information she had. She believed that calm would protect her, that competence would speak, that patience would be rewarded. She wasn't wrong. She was just incomplete. I needed to live through the imbalance to understand it, to feel the cost of invisibility before I could define its limits, to see how systems rely on silence before I could withdraw mine responsibly. I don't feel bitterness. I don't replay the screenshot in my mind anymore. I don't measure myself against the people who overlooked me. What I carry now is discernment. I know how easily quiet people are underestimated, and how much leverage that underestimation creates. I know that dominance doesn't require volume, that reversal doesn't require spectacle. Sometimes it just requires someone to stop compensating. I also know that dignity isn't something you demand from others. It's something you enforce through consistency. I haven't become louder. I've become clearer. And clarity has a way of changing the room, even when you don't say much at all. This is who I am now. Not someone who waits to be seen, but someone who knows exactly what she contributes and chooses where to place it. There's a quiet lesson inside this story that took me a long time to understand. It isn't about being right. It isn't about winning. And it isn't about making anyone regret how they treated you. It's about recognizing the moment when silence stops being a virtue and starts becoming a cost. Many of us are taught, especially those of us who are calm, capable, and conscientious, that staying quiet is mature. That absorbing friction is part of being professional. That if we don't react, things will sort themselves out. Sometimes they do, but sometimes silence doesn't preserve peace. It preserves imbalance. The hardest part of this journey wasn't being overlooked. I realized how much of my identity had been built around making things easier for others. How often I equated value with usefulness. How rarely I asked whether the system I was loyal to was loyal to me. The screenshot wasn't the wound. The read receipts weren't the betrayal. They were signals. Signals that visibility was conditional. That accountability flowed in one direction. That mistakes were public when it was convenient, and labor was invisible when it was comfortable. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a perfectly timed speech. It was a withdrawal of unpaid emotional and cognitive labor. Not as punishment, but as alignment. I didn't need to humiliate anyone to reclaim my dignity. I didn't need to expose anyone publicly. I didn't need to demand recognition in a way that made me smaller. I just needed to stop filling gaps that were never mine to fill. And when I did, the system revealed itself. That's the moral I want to leave you with. If your absence creates chaos, your presence was doing more than you were credited for. And if your silence is required for something to function smoothly, that silence isn't neutral. It's structural. Quiet dominance doesn't look like control. It looks like clarity. It looks like a restraint. It looks like knowing when not to step in. If you're someone who has been underestimated because you don't announce yourself, if you've been relied on because you don't complain, if you've stayed quiet because you didn't want to be seen as difficult, I hope this story reminds you that dignity doesn't require volume. It requires boundaries. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let the system feel what you've been carrying. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that staying quiet was costing you more than speaking up? Share your experience in the comments.